Powerful hands often dig deep, but greed digs deeper still. In a sun-baked enclave, an HOA president mistook a black farmer for an easy mark. She ordered an illegal tunnel under his fields, siphoning the aquifer to crown their manicured paradise. He looked solitary, outmatched, tied to soil and memory. But the land had taught him pressure, patience, and how water answers theft. When his well faltered, he redirected the flow through their hidden vein, turning fountains to geysers and lawns to swamps. By the time the flood receded, their scheme, sponsors, and swagger would be drowned, and justice would speak. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Anthony Ridley stood at the edge of his field as the Texas sun painted the morning sky in streaks of orange and pink. The fresh dawn air carried the earthy scent of fertile soil and growing crops. He bent down, scooping up a handful of dark earth, letting it sift through his weathered fingers. This land knew his touch, just as it had known his father's and his grandmother's before that. The irrigation pipes hummed softly as water flowed from the ancient aquifer deep beneath his property. Anthony walked the rows of his corn crop, checking each section of pipe for proper flow. His boots left careful prints in the soft dirt between the growing stalks. The system wasn't fancy, just honest metal and PVC that he maintained himself, but it was efficient and reliable, like everything else on the farm. "Looking good today," he murmured, adjusting a connector where the water pressure seemed a bit low. The corn was coming in strong this season, the stalks already chest-high, and a healthy deep green. His late wife Sarah would have loved to see it. She always said the best mornings were spent walking the fields together. Anthony paused at the eastern fence line, where his property met the new housing development. The contrast was stark. His living, breathing farmland against their perfectly manicured lawns and identical beige houses. The development had sprung up just last year, replacing old Johnson's cattle ranch after he passed. The loss of that buffer zone still stung. Making his way back to the barn, Anthony checked on his small herd of cattle. They grazed contentedly in the pasture, black dots against the green grass still wet with dew. These animals were descendants of the first few cows his grandparents had bought after finally securing ownership of the land. Each generation had added to the herd, building it slowly but surely, just as they'd built everything else here, with patience and determination. Inside the barn, Anthony found the old tin box where he kept the farm's documents. The deed was there, yellowed but carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. His fingers traced the date, 1872. That was when his great-grandparents, just a decade after emancipation, had managed to buy these first 40 acres. They'd been sharecroppers before that, working land that belonged to others, dreaming of the day they'd have their own. "You'd be proud," he whispered to their memory. The farm had grown to over 200 acres now, each addition paid for in full, each improvement made with their own hands. The aquifer had been their salvation during the tough years when drought had withered other farms. That underground river had never failed them. Anthony spent the rest of the morning checking fence lines and mending a broken gate hinge. The work was peaceful, punctuated only by the occasional lowing of cattle and the distant calls of meadowlarks. Around noon, he drove his old pickup to the far western field to check on the soybeans he'd planted there. The temperature rose as the day wore on, but Anthony barely noticed. This was the kind of heat that meant life to his crops, the kind that drew the precious water up from the aquifer through limestone and soil to nourish everything it touched. He'd learned to read the land like a book. Every dip and rise, every change in soil color told a story about what lay beneath. As evening approached, he made one final round of the irrigation system. The water pressure seemed a bit lower than usual, but that wasn't uncommon this time of year. Still, something felt off. The cattle were restless, clustering together instead of spreading out to graze, as they usually did at dusk. After dinner, Anthony sat on his porch, a habit he'd kept since Sarah passed. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and crickets struck up their evening chorus. He could see lights coming on in the housing development, each window a perfect square of artificial brightness. The night settled in, bringing with it the familiar sounds of his land: wind in the corn, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth. But then something else caught his attention. At first, it was so faint he thought he might be imagining it. A low rumble, like distant thunder, except it came from below rather than above. Anthony stood, walking out into the yard. The vibration was clearer now, a mechanical grinding that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. His cattle, usually settled for the night, began to move uneasily in their pasture, their nervous lowing carrying across the darkened fields. Anthony pressed his palm flat against the ground, feeling the tremors more distinctly now. Whatever it wasn't natural. No earthquake or settling earth made sounds like that. The rumbling grew stronger, then faded, only to return again, moving like some giant underground creature tunneling beneath his land. In the darkness, his cattle bunched together, their shapes barely visible, but their distress clear in their movements and sounds. Anthony stood in the night, listening to that strange mechanical grinding beneath his feet, a sound that had no place here among the natural rhythms of his farm. The vibrations traveled through his boots, up his legs, setting every nerve on edge with their alien presence. The noise seemed to be coming from the direction of the housing development, but that made no sense. What could they be doing at this hour that would shake the earth itself? Anthony remained still, focusing on the sound, trying to understand what he was hearing. His cattle continued their nervous movements, their hooves drumming softly against the ground as they shifted in the dark, adding their own percussion to the unsettling symphony beneath the soil. The next morning dawned hazy and humid. Anthony was already up before sunrise, his sleep disturbed by memories of those strange vibrations. He pulled on his work boots and headed straight for the eastern fence line, where he'd heard the sounds strongest. The dew-dampened grass soaked his pant legs as he walked. Something bright caught his eye, a flash of orange among the green. Drawing closer, he found surveyor stakes driven into his soil, their neon tips like warning flags. They formed a line, spaced every 20 feet or so, running parallel to the development's fence. What in the world? Anthony knelt to examine one of the stakes. The plastic tag attached to it bore numbers and markings he didn't understand, but the stake was fresh, the disturbed soil around its base still loose. These hadn't been here yesterday. Behind the stakes, deep tire tracks cut through his field, the kind made by heavy equipment, not regular trucks. The tracks led to a clearing just beyond his property line, where the grass had been completely flattened. Anthony's jaw tightened. Someone had brought machinery onto his land without permission. He followed the tracks back toward the development. A familiar voice called out from the other side of the fence. "Morning, Anthony." It was Dale Henderson, whose small ranch bordered both Anthony's farm and the new houses. The old rancher was walking his fence line, something he did every morning like clockwork. "Dale," Anthony nodded, walking over to meet him. "You see any equipment out here last night?" Dale's weathered face creased with concern. "Sure did. Big trucks, the kind they use for serious digging. Came in after dark, which ain't normal for construction work." He spat into the grass. "Been hearing things, too. Word is those developers are planning something big." "What kind of big?" Anthony asked, though his stomach was already knotting with suspicion. "Don't rightly know," Dale shook his head. "But that HOA president, that Marjorie Kane woman, she's been bragging about some fancy water feature they're putting in. talking about raising property values, making the place more exclusive. He said the last word like it tasted bad. Anthony looked back at the surveyor's stakes. They need permits for that kind of work. Should, Dale agreed. But you know how things work around here lately. Money talks, paperwork walks. He adjusted his hat, squinting at the morning sun. Them developers got the county eating out of their hand. Building inspector's brother-in-law works for their construction company, if you catch my meaning. Anthony caught it all too well. He'd seen how the development had skirted regulations before, cutting down protected trees and filling in wetlands with barely a whisper of protest from local authorities. Keep your eyes open, Dale advised. Something ain't right about all this. They're moving too fast, working odd hours, like they don't want folks seeing what they're up to. After Dale moved on, Anthony walked the entire line of stakes, counting 23 in total. They formed a perfect arc that curved away from the development and into his field. He pulled out his phone and took pictures, making sure to capture the tire tracks and the flattened clearing as well. Throughout the day, Anthony tried to focus on his regular tasks, feeding livestock, checking irrigation lines, fixing a broken tractor belt. But his mind kept returning to those stakes and what they might mean. The water pressure in his irrigation system seemed even lower today, though the aquifer had never failed before. Late afternoon brought the sound of engines from the development's side. Anthony walked to the fence line and saw several large trucks pulling away, including a drilling rig. The workers ignored his presence, avoiding eye contact as they packed up their equipment. He waited until the sun had set, darkness settling over the land like a heavy blanket. The night was quieter than the previous one. No mechanical grinding, no restless cattle. But that only made Anthony more suspicious. Taking a shovel from his truck, he returned to the line of stakes. He chose one near the middle of the arc and began to dig. The soil gave way easily, too easily for land that hadn't been worked. Someone had already disturbed this earth recently. 3 feet down, his shovel struck something hard. Anthony carefully cleared away more dirt, revealing a section of new concrete. He pressed his palm against it and felt a faint vibration, like water moving through a pipe. The pieces started coming together in his mind. The surveyor's stakes, marking a curve. The late-night work. The dropping water pressure. The HOA's planned water feature. His hands tightened on the shovel handle as anger rose in his chest. Working methodically, Anthony dug several more test holes along the stake line. Each one revealed the same thing. Fresh concrete about 3 feet down, all carrying that subtle vibration. Someone had installed an underground structure on his property, without his knowledge or permission. In the darkness, Anthony stood in one of the holes he'd dug, feeling the vibrations through his boots. The soil here held memories of his grandparents' sweat, his parents' dreams, his own lifetime of work. Now strangers had violated it, burrowing beneath like thieves in the night. He climbed out and stood looking toward the development, where lights blazed in perfect rows of identical houses. His land had survived drought, storms, and hardship. It had provided for his family through generations of struggle. Whatever these people were planning, they had chosen the wrong farmer to push around. The next morning arrived with streaks of pink and orange painting the sky. Anthony had barely slept, his mind churning with plans. He pulled his old pickup truck onto the rough path along the fence line, the bed loaded with a sledgehammer, work lights, and his phone, ready to document everything. The morning air was cool against his skin as he unloaded his equipment. He'd chosen the spot carefully, where the vibrations felt strongest and the ground showed signs of recent work. Setting up the work lights on their stands, he positioned them to illuminate the area he planned to investigate. Anthony took several photos of the undisturbed scene first, the surveyor's stakes, the disturbed soil, the measuring tape he laid out to show scale. Everything had to be documented properly. His hands were steady as he worked, though anger simmered just below the surface. "Let's see what you've been up to," he muttered, gripping the sledgehammer. The first strike cracked the concrete beneath the soil. He worked methodically, breaking away chunks until a dark space appeared below. The sound echoed across his quiet fields as cattle watched from the distance. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he cleared away the broken concrete and dirt. The hole grew larger, revealing wooden support beams that formed a tunnel large enough for a person to crawl through. The craftsmanship was professional. This was no amateur operation. Anthony set up his phone on a tripod, making sure it captured everything. "This here's my land," he spoke clearly for the recording. "Been in my family for 3 generations. Never gave permission for any construction." He panned the camera to show the GPS coordinates displayed on his other phone, then focused back on the tunnel. The sound hit him first, a steady rushing noise that grew louder as he cleared more debris. Water, just as he'd suspected. A large pipe ran along the bottom of the tunnel, secured with heavy brackets. Even in the worklight's glare, he could see water flowing through the semi-transparent sections. "This pipe's carrying water from my aquifer," he continued for the camera. "Following these stakes, it runs from my well area straight to that HOA development." He touched the pipe carefully. It was professional grade, meant to handle significant pressure. Anthony climbed down into the tunnel, ducking his head under the support beams. The space was cramped but navigable. He shone his flashlight in both directions, toward his well and toward the development. The tunnel disappeared into darkness both ways. "Got to be at least 100 yards of this," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "All of it dug under my land without a single word to me." He focused his camera on a joint in the pipe, where water leaked slightly, forming a small puddle. The craftsmanship told him this wasn't cheap work. Someone had spent serious money to steal his water. The wooden supports were pressure-treated lumber, the concrete reinforced with rebar. This was meant to last. Standing in the tunnel, Anthony felt the weight of generations pressing down on him. His grandparents had worked as sharecroppers on this very soil before finally saving enough to buy it. His parents had fought off developers and drought to keep it productive. Now, here he was, watching strangers steal the lifeblood of his farm through a hole they'd dug like thieves. He took more footage, being thorough, close-ups of the construction, the water flow, the way the tunnel had been hidden. His hands were shaking slightly now, not from fatigue, but from a deep, burning anger he hadn't felt in years. Back above ground, Anthony called his niece Jasmine. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert, despite the early hour. "Uncle Tony? Everything okay?" "Need your help, Jazz," he said, still filming the tunnel. "Got something here people need to see." "What am I looking at?" she asked, after he sent her the first video clip. "HOA next door dug a tunnel under my land," he explained, his voice controlled but tight. "They're stealing water from my aquifer to fill their fancy lake." "They what?" Jasmine's voice rose with indignation. "That's completely illegal. Did you call the sheriff?" "Will do, but we both know how that might go." Anthony recorded another angle of the tunnel. "Need to get this out there first. Make sure it can't be swept under the rug." "Send me everything," Jasmine said. He could hear keys clicking as she typed. "Every video, every photo. I'll post it everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Tag all the local news stations." Anthony continued filming as he explained the situation in detail. The night work, the surveyor's stakes, the dropping water pressure that now made terrible sense. Each piece of evidence carefully documented. "Got it all," Jasmine said, after he sent the last clip. Her voice had that fierce tone he recognized, the same one her mother, his sister, used to get when facing down injustice. "This is going online right now, Uncle. This has to be seen." "Make sure they can't deny it," Anthony said, standing at the edge of the tunnel. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting his shadow across the exposed theft of his water, his rights, his heritage. "Trust me," Jasmine replied, determination clear in her voice. "By noon, everyone's going to know exactly what they did. Let them try to explain this away." The evening sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Oakwood Heights as Anthony parked his truck in front of the development's clubhouse. The two-story building, with its pristine white columns and perfectly trimmed hedges, stood like a monument to excess. Luxury cars filled the parking lot, Mercedes, BMWs, and gleaming SUVs that had never seen a speck of mud. Anthony straightened his collar and grabbed his tablet. He'd changed into clean work clothes, but he knew he'd still stand out among the HOA crowd. Not that he cared. He had truth on his side. The meeting was already in progress when he pushed through the heavy double doors. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned. The room was filled with about 40 people, most in business attire, seated in neat rows of folding chairs. At the front, behind a polished wooden table, sat the HOA board members with Marjorie Kane at the center. Marjorie's carefully styled blonde hair and designer outfit screamed money and power. Her lips curved into a dismissive smirk as she regarded Anthony. "Well, well," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "I wasn't aware we had invited guests tonight." "Didn't need an invitation," Anthony replied, his voice steady and strong. "Not when you're stealing from me." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Marjorie's perfectly manicured hand tightened on her gavel. "Mr. Ridley, this is a private meeting for Oakwood Heights residents only. If you have concerns, you can schedule an appointment with—" "Already tried that route," Anthony cut in, walking down the center aisle. "Your office keeps saying you're unavailable. Funny how that works." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Near the back, Anthony noticed Bill and Sarah Whitman, the retired couple who'd been friendly to him since they moved in. Bill gave him a slight nod. "If you don't leave immediately," Marjorie said, her voice sharp as a razor, "I'll have security escort you out." Anthony reached the front and turned to face the crowd. "Before you do that, folks might want to see what's happening under their fancy development." He held up his tablet. "Found something interesting on my land this morning." "This is completely inappropriate," one of the board members, a balding man in an expensive suit, protested. "We have an agenda to follow." "Your agenda can wait," Anthony said firmly. "Unless you're all okay with being part of water theft?" That got their attention. Even those who had been pointedly ignoring him now looked up with interest. Marjorie's face tightened, a flash of something, worry, anger, crossing her features before she controlled it. "These are baseless accusations," she declared, but Anthony was already connecting his tablet to the room's projector system. The screen behind the board table flickered to life. The video started playing. Crystal clear footage of the tunnel, the industrial-grade pipe, the flowing water. Anthony's steady voice narrated the discovery, explaining the GPS coordinates and the direct line to the development's lake. Gasps filled the room. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" Sarah Whitman covered her mouth in shock, while Bill's face darkened with anger. "This tunnel," Anthony said, pointing to the screen, "runs from my well straight to your lake. Pipes professional grade. Tunnels well built. Must have cost a fortune." He turned to Marjorie. "Wonder who approved that expense." Marjorie stood, her height elevated by expensive heels. "What an interesting piece of fiction," she said smoothly. "Anyone can dig a hole and claim victimhood. Do you have permits for that excavation on your property, Mr. Ridley?" "Permits?" Anthony let out a short, bitter laugh. "For discovering theft on my own land?" "The HOA has all necessary water rights and construction permits," Marjorie continued, her voice dripping with condescension. "Our lake and irrigation system are fully legal and approved by the county." "Show them," Anthony challenged. "Show these people the permits for digging under my property." A middle-aged woman in the third row stood up. "Ms. Kane, did the board vote on this construction project?" "Sit down, Helen," Marjorie snapped. "This is not the time for—" "I think it is the time," Bill Whitman called from the back. "We're paying HOA fees. We deserve to know what they're funding." More voices joined in, demanding answers. Anthony watched as the unity of the room cracked, neighbors turning to each other with worried whispers and accusatory glances. Marjorie slammed her gavel repeatedly. "Order! I will have order!" When the room quieted, she fixed Anthony with a cold stare. "Mr. Ridley, your accusations are slanderous. If you continue, you'll be hearing from our lawyers." "Already sent copies to my lawyer," Anthony replied calmly, "along with the County Water Board, EPA, and every news station in a 100-mile radius." He gestured to the screen where the video showed the water flowing through the stolen pipeline. "Hard to deny what's right there in black and white." "We'll see who the law believes," Marjorie said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. Her perfectly made-up face held the smirk of someone used to getting their way, someone who knew which palms to grease and which strings to pull. A respected homeowners association, or a farmer with a grudge. The way she said "farmer" made it sound like a slur. Several board members nodded along with her, their expressions suggesting they'd already decided who would win this fight. Anthony's boots echoed through the empty halls of the County Water Board office early the next morning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the institutional green walls. He carried a thick folder containing printouts of the video footage, property documents, and his well permits dating back 3 generations. The receptionist barely glanced up from her computer. "Take a number," she droned, though the waiting area was empty. "Ma'am, I've got evidence of water theft," Anthony said, keeping his voice level. "Need to speak with someone in charge." After 20 minutes of waiting, a balding man in a rumpled shirt finally appeared. "Mr. Ridley? I'm Dave Morton. Let's make this quick." Morton's office was cramped, with stacks of papers everywhere and a small window that looked out onto the parking lot. He didn't offer Anthony a seat. "I've got proof the Oakwood Heights HOA dug an illegal tunnel," Anthony explained, spreading out his documentation. "They're stealing water from my aquifer." Morton barely glanced at the evidence. "Have you considered that the development might have legitimate water rights? On my land? Without my permission?" Anthony pulled out his property deed. "This shows clear boundaries and water rights going back to 1890. "Things change, Mr. Ridley." Morton shuffled papers on his desk. "Development brings progress. The county has broad authority to adjust water rights for the greater good." "Greater good?" Anthony felt his jaw tighten. "You mean stealing from a working farm to fill decorative fountains?" Morton's face hardened. "I'd be careful throwing around accusations. The Oakwood Heights development brings in substantial tax revenue. They employ a lot of people, create opportunities. And that makes theft legal?" "I'm very busy, Mr. Ridley." Morton stood up. "File a formal complaint if you want, but I wouldn't expect much. These matters are complicated." Anthony recognized the dismissal for what it was. He gathered his papers, his hands steady despite his rising anger. "Seems pretty simple to me. Right and wrong usually is." The sheriff's office wasn't any better. The front desk deputy took one look at Anthony's documents and said the sheriff was in meetings all day. When Anthony insisted on waiting, 2 hours passed before anyone would speak to him. Finally, a senior deputy emerged, looking annoyed at the interruption. "Water disputes are civil matters," he said, without even sitting down. "Take it up with your lawyer." "This isn't a dispute," Anthony insisted. "It's theft, trespassing, property damage. You got any proof they didn't have permission to build that tunnel?" "Permission from who?" "It's my land." The deputy shrugged. "County records show various easements and development rights in that area." Lot of paperwork filed recently. Above my pay grade to sort out? As Anthony turned to leave, frustration burning in his chest, a young deputy caught his eye. Deputy Moreno, according to his nameplate, gestured subtly for Anthony to follow him toward the water fountain. "They've bought everyone off," Moreno whispered, pretending to fix his uniform. "Marjorie Kane's got connections all the way to the state capitol. Building inspectors, permit office, water board, they're all in her pocket." "That's not right," Anthony said quietly. "No, it's not." Moreno glanced around nervously. "But be careful. She's ruthless when crossed. Last guy who challenged her lost everything in legal fees." Over the next few days, Anthony tried every official channel he could think of. The State Environmental Agency, the county commissioners, even his congressman's office. Each time, he hit the same wall of indifference or thinly veiled hostility. Meanwhile, the rumbling under his fields grew louder. His well pressure dropped steadily. The spring-fed pond where his cattle drank was down 2 feet and falling. He was checking the water level again when he saw the black SUV coming up his driveway. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, holding a thick envelope. "Anthony Ridley?" The man's tone was professionally detached. "You've been served." The legal documents were dense with judicial language, but the message was clear. The HOA was suing him for water theft, claiming he had illegally tapped into their protected aquifer system. They demanded immediate cessation of all water use on his farm, plus damages of over $1 million. Anthony sat at his kitchen table, reading through the papers again and again as evening fell. Photos of his grandparents watched from the wall, their proud faces the day they'd finally owned this land outright. His father standing beside the first tractor they'd bought new. His late wife tending her garden, the soil rich and black from years of care. The lawsuit wasn't just about water. Every line of legal jargon was designed to break him financially, to drown him in court costs and legal fees until he had no choice but to sell. They wanted his land, the last working farm amid their expanding development, and they'd found a way to twist the law into a weapon. His hands didn't shake as he carefully stacked the papers. The kitchen was quiet, except for the tick of the old clock his mother had hung decades ago. Through the window he could see the lights of Oakwood Heights glowing in the distance, their fountains sparkling as they sprayed his stolen water into the air. The HOA thought they could use their money and influence to grind him down, to make him give up what generations of his family had worked to build. They expected him to break under the pressure of their lawyers and their lies. But they didn't understand what this land meant. They didn't know the strength that ran as deep as the aquifer they were trying to steal. Anthony's grandfather had taught him that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Anthony's kitchen filled with morning light as Jasmine spread their evidence across the table. Her teacher's organization skills showed in the neat stacks of labeled folders and color-coded tabs. "Look at this timeline I made, Uncle," she said, pointing to a detailed chart. "Every incident, every interaction with the HOA, it's all here. And these red marks? That's when our well pressure started dropping." Anthony nodded, studying the pattern. "You've done good work here, baby girl." "I'm not done yet." Jasmine pulled out her laptop. "That video of the tunnel? It's got over 50,000 views now. People are sharing their own HOA horror stories in the comments. We're not alone in this. Sharing stories won't stop them stealing our water," Anthony said quietly. "No, but it shows a pattern." Jasmine's fingers flew over the keyboard. "And look, 3 other farmers in different counties reported similar incidents. Same developer, same tactics. They're trying to push out family farms all over the state." Anthony's pastor, Reverend Marcus, sat across from them, his weathered Bible beside him on the table. He'd known Anthony's family for 30 years, had buried Anthony's wife and parents. "The Lord tells us to seek justice," Reverend Marcus said, his deep voice gentle but firm. "But he also warns us to be wise as serpents. These people, they're counting on you to react with anger, to make mistakes." "I am angry," Anthony admitted. "They're not just stealing water. They're trying to steal our history, everything my family built." "Then we fight smart," Jasmine insisted. "I've been talking to Bill and Sarah Whitman from the development. They're retired military, bought in before Marjorie Kane took over the HOA board. They've got copies of all the original planning documents." "The ones that don't show any tunnel?" Anthony asked. "Exactly." Jasmine pulled out more papers. "And Sarah used to do community organizing. She knows how to research property records, track money trails. She's found some interesting connections between Marjorie and the county commissioners." Reverend Marcus leaned forward. "Anthony, remember when your daddy faced down that bank that tried to foreclose during the drought of '85? He didn't just get mad. He got organized. Built a case so strong they had to back down." Anthony touched the worn leather Bible. "Daddy always said the truth was like water. It finds its way out eventually." "Then let's help it along," Jasmine said. She opened another folder. "I've got statements from 3 former construction workers who quit when they realized the tunnel was illegal. They're willing to testify." They worked through the morning, building their case piece by piece. Anthony brought out old photographs showing the original well placement, property surveys from his grandfather's time, water quality reports going back decades. Each document told part of their story. "We need to show it's not just about the water," Reverend Marcus said. "It's about a pattern of corruption, of powerful people thinking they can take whatever they want." "Like this," Jasmine said, pulling up an email on her phone. "Remember Mrs. Johnson's flower shop? The one that used to be at the edge of the development? Sarah found proof the HOA deliberately flooded her basement, then called code enforcement about the mold. Forced her to sell for pennies on the dollar." Anthony's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Johnson was at my wife's funeral. Brought food for 3 days straight. And here's something else." Jasmine spread out a series of satellite photos. "See how the development keeps expanding? Each time, they target family-owned properties, create problems with water, roads, whatever it takes. Then swoop in when people can't fight anymore. The question is," Reverend Marcus said, "how do we stop them?" "We build a wall of truth so high they can't climb over it," Jasmine declared. "Every permit, every inspection, every deed, we check it all. Find the lies. And we keep sharing that video, keep telling our story, make it too big for them to bury." They worked until evening, organizing their evidence into clear, compelling chapters. Anthony felt his spirit lifting as their case took shape. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was purpose, direction. But when he went to check the well pressure before sunset, reality hit hard. The gauge showed another significant drop. Standing in the gathering dusk, he could hear the faint mechanical sounds from underground, the HOA's pumps working harder than ever. He walked his fields, boots sinking into soil that felt drier than it should. The corn was showing stress, leaves curling at the edges. His cattle clustered around the shrinking pond, sensing the change. At the fence line, he could see the lights of Oakwood Heights blazing against the darkening sky. Their fountains still danced, throwing up graceful arcs of stolen water. Music drifted from the clubhouse. Another HOA party, celebrating their successful community. The well gauge clicked steadily lower as he watched. Each tick represented more of his family's lifeblood being drained away. All their careful documentation, all their evidence, it meant nothing to the pumps grinding away beneath his feet. Anthony touched the dry earth, feeling the vibrations of the machines. The HOA wasn't just maintaining their tunnel anymore. They were expanding it, pushing deeper, taking more. Despite the video evidence, despite the legal challenges, Despite everything, they were accelerating their theft. He straightened up, brushing dirt from his hands. Tomorrow, he'd show Jasmine and Reverend Marcus the new pressure readings, add them to their growing file of evidence. But tonight, watching his grandfather's well slowly fail, Anthony felt the weight of generations on his shoulders. The land that had sustained his family for so long was being bled dry, and all the documentation in the world couldn't stop those pumps from running. The evening sun cast long shadows across the Whitmans' backyard as Anthony slipped through their back gate. Bill Whitman, a tall man with military-straight posture despite his gray hair, ushered him quickly inside their garage. "Sorry for the cloak and dagger routine," Sarah Whitman whispered, closing the garage door. "But Marjorie has her little spies everywhere in this development, eyes on every street." The garage had been converted into a home office, with filing cabinets lining one wall and a large desk covered in papers. A small window air conditioner hummed quietly, fighting the Texas heat. "We should have done more research before buying here," Bill said, pulling out a chair for Anthony. 20 years in the Air Force, I thought I knew how to spot trouble. But this place—" He shook his head. Sarah opened a filing cabinet, removing a thick folder. "We've been keeping records since day one." Something felt off about how fast they were pushing through changes, raising fees. "At first we thought it was just typical HOA nonsense," Bill added. "You know, fussing about paint colors and lawn height. But then we noticed the pattern." Sarah spread documents across the desk. "Look at these permit applications. See the dates? They filed for waterline modifications months before they even approached the properties they wanted to buy." Anthony leaned forward, studying the papers. The HOA's planning went back further than he'd imagined. They knew they'd get those properties one way or another. "Because they rigged the game," Bill said, his voice tight with anger. "Create problems, then swoop in with lowball offers. We've seen it happen to 3 families already." Sarah pulled out more papers, inspection reports, contractor invoices, meeting minutes. "The real smoking gun is in the original development plans. No mention of any tunnel or aquifer access. But look at these equipment rental records." Anthony saw the dates matched perfectly with when he'd first heard the underground noises. They didn't even try to hide it. "They didn't think they had to," Bill said. "Marjorie brags at parties about her connections. County commissioners, judges, even state representatives. They're all in her pocket. Or scared of her," Sarah added. "She keeps files on everyone, knows every skeleton in every closet." A car door slammed somewhere outside. They all froze, listening. After a moment, Sarah relaxed. Just the neighbors. "But this is what it's like here now. Everyone watching, whispering." "We're not the only ones who hate what's happening," Bill said. "But most folks are too scared to speak up. Mortgages to pay, kids in school. Marjorie knows how to make life difficult. Like what she did to the Hendersons," Sarah said. "Their daughter had a swimming accident at the community pool. Nothing serious, thank God. But suddenly their pool access was revoked. Safety concerns, they said. Then their parking permits disappeared. Fines started piling up. They moved out last month," Bill finished. "Couldn't take it anymore." Anthony studied the couple's faces. The guilt, the anger, the determination. "Why are you helping me? You're taking a big risk." Sarah's eyes flashed. "Because it's right. And because we've seen this before." Bill's last posting was in Alabama. The base commander there tried similar tricks with local farmers, thought he could push people around because he had rank. "Didn't work out so well for him," Bill said with a grim smile. "Sometimes the little guy wins, if he's got truth on his side. And documentation." He patted the pile of papers. "There's more," Sarah said. She opened her laptop, typed briefly. "These are internal emails from the HOA board. Notice how they never explicitly mention the tunnel? Always use code words: infrastructure improvement, resource acquisition. Coward's language, Bill muttered. Too afraid to write down what they're really doing. Anthony took photos of each document with his phone, careful to capture every detail. The evidence was damning, proof of systematic corruption, of calculated theft. You need to be careful with these, Sarah warned. If Marjorie figures out where they came from, I'll protect you, Anthony promised. No one will know. It's not just us we're worried about, Bill said. These people, they play dirty. That fire at the Martinez place last year? Everyone knows it wasn't electrical like they claimed. Sarah touched Anthony's arm. We've seen what they do to people who stand up to them. Just watch your back. They packed the documents carefully into a plain manila envelope. Bill checked the street through the blinds before leading Anthony to the back gate. We'll keep gathering what we can, Sarah whispered. There are others here who want to help. Good people who hate what's happening. Anthony gripped their hands in thanks, then slipped away through the growing darkness. He took a roundabout route home, watching for followers, but the development streets were quiet except for the endless fountain displays. His farm felt different as he approached. Darker, more threatening. The security light he'd left on by the barn was dark. As he got closer, he saw the bulb had been smashed. The note was pinned to the barn door with a hunting knife, the blade driven deep into the wood. The paper fluttered in the evening breeze, white against the weathered red paint. 4 words in neat typewriter print: "Sell now before it gets worse." Anthony stood there, feeling the weight of the documents in his hands, hearing Bill and Sarah's warnings echo in his mind. The knife gleamed dully in the last light of day, its message as clear as the words on the paper. The county courthouse stood tall and imposing in the morning sun, its limestone walls gleaming. Anthony straightened his tie, the same one he'd worn to his wife's funeral, and took a deep breath before climbing the wide steps. His lawyer, Maria Chen, met him at the entrance. She was young but fierce, recommended by Jasmine, who knew her from law school. "Ready?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "Remember, let me do the talking." Inside the courtroom, Marjorie and her HOA board members sat in expensive suits, their own team of lawyers spreading papers across their table. They barely glanced at Anthony as he walked past. Judge Harrison, a weathered man with steel-gray hair, called the court to order. Marjorie's lead attorney stood first, launching into practiced arguments about property rights and development needs. "The HOA's infrastructure projects are fully permitted," he declared, waving documents. "Mr. Ridley's accusations are baseless attempts to obstruct progress." Maria rose calmly when her turn came. "Your Honor, we have evidence that those permits were obtained through fraud." She approached the bench with the files from the Whitmans, careful not to reveal their source. "These documents show systematic deception in the HOA's applications." She displayed the timeline of equipment rentals, overlaid with satellite photos showing unauthorized construction. The HOA began tunneling before any permits were issued. "They're stealing water from a historic aquifer that sustained my client's farm for generations," Marjorie whispered urgently to her lawyer, who jumped up with objections. But Maria was ready. She played Anthony's video of the illegal tunnel, then showed the original development plans with no mention of water diversion. "And most damning," Maria continued, "these internal HOA communications show board members deliberately concealing their true intentions." She handed over printed emails, watching Judge Harrison's expression darken as he read. The HOA's lawyer tried to dismiss the evidence as circumstantial, but his voice lacked conviction. Judge Harrison held up his hand for silence. "I've seen enough," he said. "The evidence suggests serious irregularities in the HOA's conduct. Until a full investigation can be completed, I'm issuing an immediate injunction. All water diversion activities must cease." Marjorie's face turned red. She started to speak, but her lawyer grabbed her arm, whispering frantically. Furthermore, the judge continued, the HOA will be required to seal any unauthorized tunnels within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in substantial penalties. Anthony felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For weeks, he'd carried the burden of fighting alone. But now, finally, someone in authority was seeing the truth. Court adjourned, Judge Harrison declared, bringing down his gavel. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Maria as she summarized the ruling. Anthony spotted Jasmine in the crowd, beaming with pride. She hugged him tight. "I knew you'd win, Uncle," she said. "Truth always comes out." They drove back to the farm together, Jasmine calling ahead to spread the good news. By evening, supporters began arriving. The Whitmans slipping in discreetly through the back way. Other neighbors Anthony hadn't even known were on his side. His kitchen filled with the smell of home cooking as everyone contributed dishes. Sarah Whitman brought her famous peach cobbler. The Martinez family arrived with still warm enchiladas. Even his pastor stopped by with a chocolate cake. Anthony set up folding tables in the yard, stringing lights between the trees. The evening air was soft and cool, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine. For the first time in weeks, he could hear natural sounds instead of construction noise, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, his cattle moving quietly in their pasture. Jasmine helped arrange plates and cups, pausing occasionally to show people the latest social media response to their victory. "The story's gone national," she said. "People are calling it a triumph of justice over greed." Bill Whitman raised his glass. "To Anthony," he said, "for showing us all how to stand up to bullies." "To evidence," Maria added with a smile. "And judges who actually read it." Anthony looked around at the gathered faces, friends old and new, united in their belief in right over wrong. The food was good, the company better, but best of all was the feeling of vindication. His grandparents had fought to own this land, his parents had preserved it, and now he'd protected it for the next generation. Jasmine touched his arm. "You okay, Uncle?" "You're quiet." "Just grateful," he said softly. "For all of you. For this moment." They ate under the stars, sharing stories and hopes for the future. Someone brought out a guitar, and old gospel songs mixed with laughter in the night air. Anthony sat back, watching his community come together, stronger for having faced down injustice. Sarah slipped him a copy of the court order, sealed in plastic. "Keep this safe," she whispered. "Frame it, maybe." "First piece of paper that's gone our way in a long time," he agreed. The celebration wasn't large or loud, but it was heartfelt. These were people who understood the value of land, of water, of doing what's right, even when it's hard. As plates were cleared and stories wound down, Anthony raised his own glass. "To hope," he said simply. "To hope," they echoed, and in that moment, watching the stars shine down on his family's land, Anthony let himself believe that maybe the worst was behind them. Past midnight, Anthony jerked awake. Something was wrong. The air in his bedroom felt thick, carrying an acrid smell that made his throat tighten. Smoke. He threw off his covers and rushed to the window. Orange flames flickered through the darkness, casting demonic shadows across his hay barn. His heart stopped for a moment, then kicked into overdrive. "No, no, no," he muttered, yanking on his boots without socks. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911 while sprinting down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. The operator's voice crackled through the speaker. "Fire department is on their way. Sir, please stay back from the building." But Anthony couldn't wait. His cattle were penned near the barn, and the summer dry hay was burning like kindling. The heat hit him like a wall as he ran across the yard, making his eyes water. The cattle were panicking, pressed against the far side of their enclosure. The metal gate was hot to the touch, making Anthony curse as he burned his palm. He wrapped his t-shirt around his hand and tried again, finally working the latch free. "Come on!" he shouted, swinging the gate wide. The cattle needed no more encouragement, thundering past him toward the safety of the far pasture. He counted them as they ran. 12, 13, 14, all accounted for. Flames were consuming the barn's wooden walls now, crackling and roaring. Anthony's lungs burned as he tried to get closer, thinking of the equipment stored inside. His old tractor, tools passed down from his father, irreplaceable things that told the story of his family's connection to this land. Sirens wailed in the distance, but they sounded too far away. The fire was spreading fast, feeding on decades of dust and dry wood. A support beam crashed down inside, sending sparks shooting skyward like angry fireflies. Neighbors began arriving, drawn by the flames and noise. The Martinez family came running with garden hoses, but the streams of water seemed pathetically small against the inferno. Sarah and Bill Whitman pulled up in their truck, Bill immediately joining Anthony in soaking the ground between the barn and other buildings. "Get back!" Sarah yelled as another beam collapsed. "Anthony, please! It's too dangerous." He knew she was right, but his feet wouldn't move. That barn had stood since his grandfather's time. They'd celebrated harvests there, sheltered from storms there, stored the tools that kept the farm alive. Finally, fire trucks roared up the dirt road, red lights painting everything in surreal flashes. Professional firefighters took over, unrolling heavy hoses and shouting orders. They pushed everyone back to a safe distance. Anthony stood with his neighbors, watching helplessly as the barn burned. Sarah kept her arm around his shoulders, and Bill pressed a bottle of water into his hands. He hadn't even realized how thirsty he was from the smoke. "Your cattle?" Bill asked quietly. "Safe," Anthony managed between coughs. "Got them out first thing." More vehicles arrived. Police cars, an ambulance, curious onlookers. Anthony recognized the young deputy who'd warned him about the HOA's influence. The deputy walked the perimeter of the fire slowly, shining his flashlight on the ground and making notes. The fire chief approached, his face grim beneath his helmet. "Sir, once we get this under control, we'll need to investigate the point of origin. Did you store any accelerants in the barn? Gas cans? Chemicals?" "Just the usual farm supplies," Anthony said, but they were all properly stored. He'd learned that lesson early from his father. Respect fire, keep things orderly. The chief nodded, then hesitated. "We found something concerning on the north side. Might want to take a look once it's safe." Hours passed. The flames gradually died down under the constant assault of water. By dawn, the barn was a smoking skeleton of blackened beams and twisted metal. The rising sun revealed the full extent of the destruction. And something else. The deputy called Anthony over, pointing to marks in the dirt. "2 sets of footprints," he said quietly. "And this." He indicated a plastic gas can lid, partially melted but clearly new. Not one of Anthony's old containers. "Doesn't prove anything," the deputy added quickly, seeing Anthony's expression. "Could have blown here from anywhere." But they both knew that wasn't true. The lid was too heavy to blow in the wind, and the footprints told their own story. Someone had crept up, poured accelerant around the barn's base, and lit it up before running away. The fire chief's official report would probably call it cause unknown. The police would file it away as unsolved. But Anthony knew exactly who was behind this. The same person who'd threatened him with ruin at the HOA meeting. Exhausted and still coughing from smoke inhalation, he watched the firefighters spray down the last hot spots. His clothes were soaked with sweat and water, his hands dirty and scraped from fighting to free the cattle. The sun climbed higher, promising another hot Texas day. Sarah brought him coffee in a thermos. "We'll help you rebuild," she said firmly. "The whole community will." Anthony nodded, but his throat was too tight to speak. The barn had been more than just a building. It was a piece of his heritage, a symbol of everything his family had built here. Now it lay in ashes because someone wanted to break his spirit. The deputy made a show of taking photos and measurements, but his earlier words hung in the air. "They've bought everyone off. Even if he found proof, would anyone act on it?" The morning sun beat down mercilessly as Anthony watched 3 county vehicles pull up his driveway, kicking up dust clouds. He recognized Wesley Thompson, head of the water board, stepping out in his pressed suit that looked ridiculous for the setting. 2 other officials followed, carrying clipboards and wearing expressions that made Anthony's stomach tighten. "Mr. Ridley," Thompson called out, not bothering to hide his smirk. "We're here about the temporary freeze on HOA water usage." Anthony wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over slowly. He'd been checking his well's water level again. It had dropped another foot since yesterday. "The investigation isn't finished," he said firmly. Thompson pulled out an official-looking document. "Actually, it is. Our experts found insufficient evidence of any wrongdoing by the HOA. The freeze is being lifted, effective immediately." "Insufficient evidence?" Anthony's voice rose. "I showed you the tunnel. I have video of their illegal pumping system." One of the other officials, a younger woman who couldn't meet his eyes, mumbled something about inconclusive documentation and possible natural geological features. "Natural features?" Anthony gestured toward his fields. "The water table's dropping by the day. My crops are dying. How is that natural?" Thompson's smile turned cold. "Mr. Ridley, if you continue having water management issues, perhaps it's time to consider other options. I understand the HOA has made several generous offers to purchase your property." The threat wasn't even subtle anymore. Anthony's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help. That's what they wanted. "This is my land," he said quietly. "Been in my family for generations. We survived droughts, storms, and worse than this." "Times change," Thompson replied. "Progress comes whether we want it or not." He handed Anthony a copy of the order and turned back to his vehicle. "Good day, Mr. Ridley." Anthony stood in the dust of their departing cars, the paper crumpling in his grip. Through the fence line, he could see the HOA's ornamental lake sparkling in the distance, fountains spraying his stolen water into the air. That afternoon, he checked his well again. The water level had dropped another 6 inches. At this rate, he'd be completely dry within weeks. His cattle were already drinking from emergency tanks he'd had to fill with expensive city water. He walked his fields slowly, touching the withering corn stalks. The soil was cracking, desperate for moisture. Generations of his family had worked this earth, turning it from hard-scrabbled dirt into fertile farmland. Now he was watching it die, killed by rich people's fountains and artificial lakes. His phone buzzed, Jasmine calling. "Uncle Anthony? I saw the county's decision online. Those corrupt crooks." Her anger was a mirror of his own pain. "Language," he said automatically, though his heart wasn't in it. "But it's true. Everyone knows Thompson's wife is on the HOA board. This whole thing stinks." Anthony sighed, leaning against his fence. "Knowing it and proving it are different things, baby girl. So what are you going to do?" He watched a cluster of HOA residents walking their designer dogs around the lake. They looked so comfortable, so entitled to their stolen wealth. "I'm still thinking on that." After hanging up, he drove to check his furthest field. The irrigation pipes there were running at barely a trickle now. He knelt and placed his hand on the ground, feeling the parched earth beneath his palm. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Land remembers, son. Every kindness, every cruelty, it all leaves a mark." Evening brought no relief. Anthony sat at his kitchen table, reviewing bills by lamplight. Water delivery costs were mounting. Without rain or his well, he'd be bankrupt by harvest time. The HOA knew this. It was part of their plan. Through his window, he could see the development's lights reflecting off their lake. Music drifted over. Another HOA party celebrating their victory, no doubt. They thought they'd won, thought they could just take whatever they wanted because they had money and connections. His gaze drifted to the framed photo on his wall. His grandparents standing proud in front of this same house, back when they'd first bought the land. They'd faced down threats and violence to keep their farm. Now here he was, watching everything they'd built slip away because of greed wrapped in paperwork. The house creaked in the cooling night air. Anthony moved to his darkened living room, settling into his father's old armchair. The only light came from the HOA's garish security lamps across the way, casting strange shadows through his windows. His mind went to the tunnel they'd dug, their own greed literally undermining his land. They'd gone under the law, under the earth itself, to steal what was his. And now they thought they were untouchable. The darkness felt heavy around him, matching his mood. But in that darkness, something was crystallizing. A plan born of desperation and justice, too long denied. They'd used his own water system against him. Maybe it was time to return the favor. If the law won't stop them. Anthony whispered into the darkness of his farmhouse, his voice barely audible above the distant party music. Then I will. Anthony woke before dawn, his mind already racing with calculations and plans. He'd spent half the night studying old irrigation manuals and sketching diagrams at his kitchen table. Now, with the first gray light seeping through his windows, he knew exactly what needed to be done. He pulled on his work boots and grabbed his toolbox. The metal handles were smooth from decades of use. First his father's hands, then his own. In the barn, he collected lengths of heavy-duty hose, pressure gauges, and the special gate valves he'd ordered last week. Each piece was part of the puzzle. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind thick brush near the fence line. Anthony cleared it carefully, not wanting to attract attention. The HOA's security patrols rarely came this far out, but he couldn't take chances. As he worked, sweat darkening his shirt despite the early hour, he thought about how they'd used this same tunnel to steal from him. Now it would become their undoing. He laid out his tools methodically, just as his father had taught him. A rushed job is a botched job, he muttered, checking each fitting and connection. The tunnel's construction was actually impressive. Steel-reinforced concrete, proper drainage slopes, even ventilation. They'd spent a fortune to steal his water in style. Around mid-morning, Bill Whitman appeared at the fence. The retired veteran looked nervous but determined. "Brought you those schematics you asked for," he said quietly, passing a rolled-up tube through the fence. Sarah copied them from the HOA office while volunteering. They show every water line in the development. Anthony nodded gratefully. "Thank you. Both of you. I know this isn't easy. What they're doing isn't right," Bill replied firmly. "Sarah and we should have spoken up sooner. Maybe if more of us had—" "You're speaking up now," Anthony said. "That counts for something." After Bill left, Anthony spread the schematics across his truck's hood. The drawings confirmed what he'd suspected. The HOA's water system was beautifully engineered, but fundamentally flawed. They'd designed it to handle the steady flow they were stealing from his well, not the full pressure his irrigation system could generate when properly configured. He worked through lunch, connecting new pressure control valves to his main line. Each one had to be perfectly calibrated. Too little pressure would make his plan ineffective. Too much could rupture the pipes before they served their purpose. His hands moved with practiced certainty, checking each seal twice. The sun climbed higher as Anthony ran new supply lines through his fields. He laid them in the irrigation ditches, hiding them under loose soil. Anyone watching would think he was just maintaining his regular watering system. Let them think that. Let them stay comfortable in their stolen security. Around 2 o'clock, Jasmine brought him lunch, a sandwich and cold tea. She watched him work while he ate, her young face creased with worry. "Uncle Anthony, are you sure about this? What if they try to blame you for damages?" He wiped his hands carefully before answering. "Can't blame me for their illegal tunnel failing. That's on them." He smiled slightly. "Besides, paper trails go both ways. I've documented every drop they've stolen, every complaint I've filed, every corrupt official who looked the other way." After Jasmine left, Anthony focused on the most crucial part, rerouting his main well pump. The huge machine thrummed with power as he adjusted its settings, increasing its capacity to maximum. He'd never run it this hard before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. He installed pressure monitors at key points, each one carefully calibrated. The digital readouts blinked steadily, showing the system was ready. Next came the control gates, heavy steel valves that would direct the water flow exactly where he wanted it. Each one had to be perfectly aligned. The afternoon wore on as Anthony checked and rechecked every connection. He couldn't afford any weak points or leaks. The HOA had built their tunnel to steal water slowly, steadily, like thieves in the night. But water could be a battering ram when properly directed, and Anthony knew every trick about handling water pressure that 3 generations of farming had taught his family. At 5 o'clock, he heard the HOA's evening social starting up. Music drifted across his fields as the residents gathered around their stolen lake. Anthony watched them through his binoculars, drinking wine, laughing, celebrating their victory over the simple farmer next door. They had no idea what was coming. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Anthony made his final preparations. He checked each pressure gauge one last time, made sure every valve was sealed tight. The moment had come. Standing at his main control panel, Anthony took a deep breath. The same hands that had nurtured this land for decades now moved with grim purpose, closing off his regular irrigation valves one by one. Each click and thunk of the heavy handles felt like sealing a fate. Finally, he reached for the last control, the emergency redirect valve. This would send the full force of his well pump straight into their tunnel. He grasped the handle firmly, feeling the smooth metal warm under his palm. "You brought this on yourselves," he said quietly, and began to turn the valve. The pressure gauges immediately responded, their needles climbing steadily as water found its new path. Anthony watched the readings rise, listening to the deep rumble of water rushing through the pipes. The pressure was building, just as he'd planned. Now there was no turning back. The sun sank lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across his fields. In the growing darkness, Anthony stood by his control panel, monitoring the gauges as they climbed higher and higher. The hum of rushing water grew stronger, and he knew his plan was working exactly as intended. Anthony watched the first rays of sunlight creep across his fields, the dew glistening on the grass. He hadn't slept all night, monitoring the pressure gauges and making minor adjustments. The readings showed everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Water steadily forcing its way through their stolen tunnel, finding every crack and weakness in their fancy development's infrastructure. The first scream cut through the morning air around 6:30 a.m., then another, and another. Soon, the quiet subdivision erupted into chaos as homeowners stepped outside to find their pristine lawns transformed into swamps. Water bubbled up through their expensive sod, turning manicured gardens into mud pits. Through his binoculars, Anthony watched the scene unfold. People in bathrobes and pajamas splashed through their flooded driveways, phones pressed to their ears as they called for help. The development's decorative lake, always so carefully maintained, had swollen far beyond its banks. The fountains, once shooting elegant streams skyward, now gurgled pathetically as water backed up through their pipes. Mrs. Peterson from Lot 14 tried to save her prized rose bushes, wading through knee-deep water with plastic sheeting. The Johnsons' kids stood on their front porch, pointing and laughing, as their father's new BMW sat half-submerged in the garage. Even the tennis courts weren't spared. The carefully leveled playing surface now resembled a series of small ponds. Emergency vehicles began arriving within the hour. Their sirens echoed across Anthony's fields as fire trucks and utility crews tried to navigate the flooded streets. Red and blue lights reflected off the water, creating an almost festive atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the growing panic. Anthony kept his distance, pretending to check his regular irrigation lines while watching the chaos unfold. He'd positioned his phone carefully in his shirt pocket, ready to record any confrontations. Years of farming had taught him patience. Now was the time to wait and watch. "It's coming up through the floors!" someone shouted from a basement window. Others began reporting the same, water forcing its way up through foundation cracks, seeping through walls, destroying expensive carpeting and furniture. The pressure had found every weakness in their hastily built homes. The HOA's maintenance crew arrived in their golf carts, looking comically inadequate against the scale of the flooding. They rushed from house to house, checking drain covers and trying to redirect the flow with sandbags. But Anthony knew their efforts were useless. The water was coming from below, through their own illegal tunnel. Around 8 o'clock, the news vans started showing up. Reporters in rain boots waded through the streets, microphones held high, broadcasting the disaster live. Homeowners crowded around them, eager to share their outrage and confusion. "We just woke up to this. Everything's ruined. Where is all this water coming from?" Bill and Sarah Whitman stood on their porch, watching the scene with knowing looks. They caught Anthony's eye across the fence and gave slight nods. They understood what was happening, and more importantly, why it was necessary. The development's showpiece, their stolen lake with its expensive fountain, finally gave way around 9. The artificial banks, never designed to handle such volume, crumbled under the pressure. A wave of water crashed through the surrounding gardens, taking with it thousands of dollars worth of landscaping and outdoor furniture. Anthony could hear Marjorie Kane's voice now, shrill and commanding as she arrived on the scene. She stormed through the flood in designer rain boots, barking orders into her phone and pointing accusingly at various workers. Her perfect hair was frizzed by the humidity, her makeup running in the morning heat. "This is sabotage!" she screamed, spinning in circles as she tried to direct the emergency response. "Someone has deliberately attacked our community." She was right, of course, but she had no proof. Just like Anthony had had no proof when they'd started stealing his water. The water continued rising. Moving vans appeared as some residents began evacuating their belongings. Children splashed through the floods on inflatable pool toys, while their parents argued with insurance adjusters who were already appearing on the scene. The carefully maintained image of suburban perfection was literally underwater. Marjorie's composure finally broke when her own basement security system started blaring. Water had reached the electrical panels. She ran toward her house, slipping and stumbling in the mud, her designer outfit ruined. When she emerged minutes later, she was soaking wet and shaking with rage. Anthony saw her gaze lock onto his farm. Her face contorted with fury as she started marching toward his property line. He calmly reached up and adjusted his phone's position in his pocket, making sure the camera lens was unobstructed. Years of dealing with corrupt officials had taught him the value of documentation. "You!" Marjorie screamed, stomping through the mud toward his fence. "You did this! You'll pay for every cent of damage." Her voice carried across the fields, drawing attention from news crews who began turning their cameras in their direction. Anthony stood his ground, saying nothing as she approached. The phone in his pocket recorded every step, every word, as Marjorie Kane, HOA president and self-proclaimed queen of the development, came to deliver her threats in person. She was drenched from head to toe, her expensive clothes caked with mud, mascara running down her cheeks, the perfect image of defeated arrogance. Anthony stood calmly as Marjorie's threats and accusations echoed across his property. His phone captured every word, every wild gesture as she promised to destroy him. Behind her, news cameras zoomed in, catching the perfect shot of the HOA president losing control while standing in ankle-deep water. "I'll make sure you never farm another acre," she screamed, jabbing her finger toward his chest. "I've got friends in high places who'll shut your water off permanently." Anthony just smiled and pulled out his phone. "Thank you, Mrs. Kane. I needed that on record." He pressed stop on the recording and quickly sent it to Jasmine. Within minutes, his niece had uploaded the video alongside footage of the flooding. Her social media skills proved devastating. She knew exactly which hashtags would grab attention, which news outlets to tag, and how to make the story spread like wildfire. The first viral post showed a split screen. On one side, the HOA's promotional video boasting about their sustainable water features, and on the other, current footage of their flooded streets. Jasmine's caption read, "HOA steals black farmers' water. Karma flows back." More reporters arrived, drawn by the viral story. They clustered around Anthony's fence line, shouting questions about water rights and discrimination. This time, he was ready to talk. He shared his documentation methodically. Photographs of the illegal tunnel, copies of ignored complaints, records of the suspicious fire, and now, Marjorie's explicit threats. "My grandparents worked this land as sharecroppers before they owned it," Anthony told the cameras. "They taught me that water follows its own path. You can guide it, but you can't steal it without consequences." By noon, state environmental regulators had arrived in their official vehicles. They parked alongside the floodwaters, pulling out testing equipment and documentation materials. The sight of their badges and clipboards sent HOA board members scurrying back to their homes. Federal investigators came next, their dark SUVs splashing through the development's ruined streets. They weren't interested in the flooding. They wanted the HOA's financial records. Years of suspicious permits and irregular payments had caught their attention. Jasmine arrived with a stack of printouts, screenshots of social media support pouring in from across the country. Similar stories emerged. Other communities where HOAs had tried to bully longtime residents. Other cases of water rights being violated. Anthony's stand had struck a nerve. "Look at this, Uncle," she said, showing him her phone. "People are organizing fundraisers to help with your legal fees. They're calling you the Water Warrior." Anthony shook his head at the nickname, but he had to admit it felt good to see the support. The Whitmans emerged from their house carrying boxes of HOA documents, years of meeting minutes, financial statements, and correspondence they'd quietly collected. "We should have spoken up sooner," Bill said, handing the files to an investigator. "But we're making it right now." Other homeowners began coming forward too. They shared stories of Marjorie's intimidation tactics, of mysterious fees and threatened liens. Each revelation added to the growing picture of corruption. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing aerial views of the flood damage. The development's perfect geometry was now distorted by swollen waterways and impromptu ponds. Expensive patio furniture floated past submerged barbecue grills, while crews tried desperately to pump out basements. Around 2 o'clock, a convoy of white vans pulled up to the HOA office. Agents emerged with search warrants ready to seize records. Marjorie tried to block their entry, claiming they needed appointments, but they brushed past her with federal authority. Box after box came out. Financial records, construction permits, correspondence with county officials. Each one was carefully logged and loaded into the vans. Some papers were hastily shredded. The agents bagged these fragments as evidence of obstruction. Homeowners gathered to watch, their anger growing with each box removed. These were their HOA dues being carried away. Thousands of dollars paid for maintenance and improvements, now revealed as evidence of fraud. "Is this where our assessment fees went?" someone shouted. "Into bribes and kickbacks? What about my flooded basement?" another called out. "Who's going to pay for that?" Marjorie tried to maintain control, to rally her supporters, but her power was visibly draining away with each new revelation. Even her loyal board members kept their distance, huddled in small groups whispering about lawyers and liability. More residents approached the investigators, eager to share their stories. A line formed outside the HOA office as people waited to give statements. Years of accumulated grievances poured out. Selective enforcement of rules, suspicious contracts, ignored complaints. The Whitmans organized an impromptu meeting in their garage, helping neighbors document damage and connect with authorities. Sarah's background in community organizing proved invaluable as she helped coordinate responses and gather evidence. "Everything has to be recorded," she insisted, passing out notepads. "Every threat, every mysterious fee, every time they ignored your complaints. It all matters now." Anthony watched from his property as the scene unfolded. The water was finally receding, leaving behind mud-stained lawns and waterlogged gardens. The development's carefully maintained facade had been literally and figuratively washed away. Marjorie stood in the middle of it all, her designer outfit ruined, her authority crumbling. She tried to approach the federal agents to explain her side, but they were more interested in the documents than her excuses. Her phone rang constantly. Lawyers, contractors, angry homeowners, but her usual confident answers had turned to desperate stammering. "Mrs. Kane," residents called out, their voices growing angrier. "Where's our money? What have you been doing with our fees?" They crowded around her, demanding explanations for years of suspicious activity suddenly exposed. Weeks later, Anthony sat in the federal courthouse, his hands folded calmly in his lap, as he watched the proceedings unfold. The courtroom was packed, reporters filled the press section, and angry homeowners occupied every available seat. Even the standing room at the back was crowded with spectators eager to see justice served. The lead investigator took the stand, methodically presenting evidence through a series of slides projected on the courtroom screen. Each image told part of the story. Bank statements showing suspicious transfers, permits issued without proper inspection, emails discussing payoffs to county officials. "Your Honor," the investigator said, pointing to a particularly damning document, "this check for $50,000 was labeled as landscaping services, but was traced to an offshore account belonging to the county water board chairman." Marjorie shifted uncomfortably in her chair at the defense table. Her usually perfect appearance had suffered during her weeks under investigation. Her designer suit looked rumpled, and dark circles showed through her makeup. Her attorneys whispered urgently to each other, scribbling notes as the evidence mounted. The prosecutor stood, holding up a thick binder. "The government will now present evidence of systematic environmental violations spanning 5 years. She began laying out photos of the illegal tunnel construction, along with soil samples showing contamination from improper drilling. Mrs. Kane personally approved these operations, the prosecutor continued, despite receiving multiple warnings about aquifer damage. She then orchestrated a cover-up, including the destruction of inspection reports and threatening witnesses. Anthony noticed Bill and Sarah Whitman sitting a few rows ahead. They had testified earlier about the HOA's pattern of intimidation and financial misconduct. Sarah caught his eye and gave him a supportive nod. The court fell silent as security footage from the night of the barn fire played on the screen. The grainy video showed two figures approaching with gas cans, then fleeing in a car registered to one of Marjorie's contractors. Phone records displayed next revealed calls between Marjorie and the contractor just before and after the fire. The defendant didn't just steal water, the prosecutor declared. She orchestrated a campaign of harassment and destruction against Mr. Ridley when he dared to stand up to her illegal activities. Several former HOA board members had already pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testimony. They described meetings where Marjorie bragged about her influence with local officials and planned ways to force Anthony off his land. Mrs. Kane told us the tunnel was legal. One former board member testified, avoiding Marjorie's glare. She said she had all the permits. When Mr. Whitman asked to see them, she threatened to put a lien on his house. The evidence kept coming. Fake inspection certificates, altered water quality reports, receipts for bribes labeled as consulting fees. Each revelation drew gasps from the spectators and triggered furious note-taking by the reporters. A hydrogeologist testified about the damage done to the aquifer. The illegal tunneling disrupted natural water flow patterns, he explained, pointing to underground mapping displays. If Mr. Ridley hadn't exposed this when he did, the entire aquifer could have been permanently compromised. Anthony's niece Jasmine sat beside him, squeezing his hand as particularly difficult evidence was presented. The photographs of his burned barn, the threatening notes, the recorded phone calls where Marjorie boasted about making his life impossible. The federal prosecutor approached the bench with another exhibit. Your Honor, these emails show Mrs. Kane specifically targeted Mr. Ridley's property because, in her words, these people don't deserve prime real estate. The racial undertones of her messages drew angry murmurs from the courtroom. Marjorie's lawyer attempted to paint the flooding as criminal vandalism, but expert testimony showed Anthony's actions had simply revealed the HOA's illegal infrastructure. The development's drainage system failed because it was never properly permitted or constructed, an engineer testified. The flooding was an inevitable result of their own illegal work. As the final pieces of evidence were presented, Anthony studied Marjorie's face. Her usual arrogant expression had crumbled into something between fear and disbelief. She had clearly never imagined being held accountable like this. The judge, a stern-faced woman who had shown little emotion throughout the trial, began reviewing the evidence summaries. The courtroom grew tense with anticipation. Reporters readied their cameras, and the federal marshals moved closer to the defense table. The evidence of corruption in this case is overwhelming, the judge began, her voice sharp with disapproval. Mrs. Kane, you abused your position of authority to commit serious environmental crimes, engaged in systematic fraud, and attempted to destroy a family farm that had existed for generations. The judge paused, looking directly at Marjorie. Your actions show a complete disregard for the law, for the environment, and for basic human decency. The court cannot ignore such flagrant criminal behavior. Marjorie stood, swaying slightly as the judge continued. Given the severity of these crimes and the clear evidence of witness tampering, this court has no choice but to order you taken into custody immediately pending sentencing. The federal marshals stepped forward, handcuffs ready. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as they approached Marjorie, who seemed to shrink with each step they took toward her. Anthony let out a long, deep breath, feeling weeks of tension finally begin to leave his body. Beside him, Jasmine wiped away tears of relief. The Whitmans turned to smile at him as Marjorie was led away, her designer heels clicking against the courtroom floor one last time. Months had passed since the courthouse drama. and spring had brought new life to Anthony Ridley's farm. The morning sun cast long shadows across fields where young corn stalks pushed through rich soil, their leaves dancing in the gentle Texas breeze. The land was healing, growing stronger with each passing day. Children's laughter echoed across the property as a group of elementary school students followed their teacher along the newly established learning trail. They stopped at educational stations where signs explained sustainable farming practices and the importance of water conservation. Anthony had used part of his compensation money to create this outdoor classroom, determined to turn his victory into something that would benefit future generations. "Mr. Ridley!" a young girl called out, waving enthusiastically. "Look what we found!" She held up a handful of earthworms, proud of her discovery in the composting area. Anthony smiled, remembering how his own grandfather had taught him about the importance of these humble creatures to healthy soil. "Those are nature's helpers," he explained, kneeling down to the children's level. "They make the soil rich, so our food can grow strong." The students crowded around, their faces bright with curiosity, as he showed them how to gently return the worms to their work underground. The restoration of his farm had become a community project. After the trial, neighbors from miles around had shown up with tools, seeds, and willing hands. Even some former HOA residents, disgusted by what their leadership had done, came to help rebuild the burned barn. What had started as one man's stand against corruption had grown into something larger, a reminder of what communities could accomplish when they stood together. Near the repaired barn, Bill Whitman was showing another group of children how the new irrigation system worked. The veteran's mechanical skills had proved invaluable in designing a more efficient watering setup. His wife Sarah had started a weekend farmers market on a corner of Anthony's land, where local growers could sell their produce directly to families. "The water pressure's better than ever," Bill called out as Anthony passed by. "Those new pipes we laid are working perfectly." The sound of running water from the irrigation ditches was steady and strong, a constant reminder that the aquifer still flowed freely beneath their feet. Anthony walked through his fields, checking the growth of his crops. The compensation from the state had allowed him to invest in better equipment and drought-resistant varieties, but it was the return of his water supply that had truly brought the land back to life. Where brown patches had once threatened to spread during the HOA's theft, green growth now flourished. Near the old fence line where the illegal tunnel had been discovered, workers were finishing a memorial garden. Stone markers told the story of the land, from his grandparents' first purchase to the recent battle for justice. Native wildflowers grew among the stones, their colors bright against the dark earth. "Uncle Anthony!" Jasmine called, walking up with her camera. She had been documenting the farm's recovery for a documentary about rural land rights. "The new seedlings in the greenhouse are ready for transplanting. And the school principal called. 3 more classes want to schedule field trips." Anthony nodded, proud of how his niece had helped transform his personal victory into a movement for education and change. Her social media posts during the crisis had brought national attention, but now they showed a different story, one of renewal and hope. The restored well house stood as a testament to resilience, its new solar-powered pump humming quietly as it drew water from the aquifer. Anthony had insisted on using part of his compensation to install monitoring equipment that tracked water quality and usage, ensuring transparency and environmental protection for years to come. A group of agricultural students from the local college worked in the demonstration garden, learning traditional farming methods alongside modern sustainable practices. Their professor, a longtime friend of Anthony's, had developed a curriculum around the farm's story, teaching future generations about both agricultural science and the importance of standing up for what's right. The afternoon sun was warm on Anthony's shoulders as he walked past the community center that had been built where the old storage shed once stood. Inside, local farmers met regularly to share knowledge and resources. Today, a class on organic pest control was in session. The teacher's voice drifting through open windows as she explained natural alternatives to harmful chemicals. Sarah Whitman's voice carried across the field as she led another group of visitors. This farm represents more than just agriculture, she was saying. It's about remembering our history and protecting what matters for future generations. Anthony smiled, knowing his late wife would have appreciated Sarah's dedication to sharing their story. The day wound down as the last school bus departed, leaving the farm peaceful in the golden afternoon light. Anthony walked the perimeter one final time, a habit he'd developed during the darkest days of the water theft. But now, each step was one of gratitude rather than worry. New saplings lined the drive where his grandfather had once planted trees, a symbol of faith in the future. Their leaves rustled in the evening breeze, small but strong, reaching toward the sky. Like the farm itself, they were young again, ready to grow into something greater. As the sun began to set, Anthony climbed the steps to his porch, the boards creaking familiarly under his feet. He settled into the old rocking chair, watching the water flow through the irrigation ditches that veined across his property. The sound was peaceful, constant, a rhythm that spoke of life and continuity. Dawn was just breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Anthony stood at the porch railing, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Below, the irrigation ditches ran clear and strong, carrying life-giving water to every corner of his land. He took a deep breath of the morning air, rich with the scent of damp earth and growing things. In a quiet voice, steady with conviction, he murmured, "They thought they could bury us, but this land remembers who it belongs to." I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.